Let's talk about microaggressions and specifically racial microaggressions, which are actions, behaviors, or words or phrases that discriminate against a marginalized group. This happens oftentimes unintentionally, but it's important to note that sometimes this does occur intentionally. You may have grew up watching the hit show That's So Raven like I did. And if you have, you may now be watching the spinoff Raven's Home. In a new episode, Booker, Raven's son, experiences a racial microaggression. Let's watch the clip.
Hey, what's going on?
This doesn't concern you, sir.
That's my grandson, so it does concern me.
So he really is your grandson?
Isn't that what he told you?
Grandpa, he said I look suspicious.
I'm just doing my job, okay? I see a kid like him in a
kid
neighborhood
like what?
Oh, come on, you know what I mean.
Unfortunately, I do.
Sir, this is not about race.
I didn't bring up race. You did.
If you have a complaint, there is a number you can
Oh, I don't need the number. I will talk to my friend, Chief Thomas, when he comes to my restaurant tomorrow morning for coffee.
You know Police Chief Thomas?
I do. And I'll make sure that he knows you, Officer Riley.
This
is actually not the first time that Raven or someone that she is close to has experienced racism or a racial microaggression. And I say that to say that Raven Simone and all of the people involved in the production of That's a Raven and now Raven's Home have been doing a good job at discussing the issues of racism and racial microaggressions on the TV series. For example, you may actually remember the episode in That's a Raven where Chelsea and Raven both applied to a job, walked through the exact same interview process, and in many instances, Raven performed better than Chelsea. And at the end of the day, only Chelsea got the position because the manager stated that she doesn't hire Black people. There are three forms of racial microaggressions that we commonly talk about. And the first of these is a micro insult, which is a hidden insulting message that demeans a person's racial heritage. And then there's a micro invalidation, which is the dismissal of a victim's feelings or experiences. And then there is a micro assault, which is like blatant discrimination, such as a verbal attack using racial slurs and name calling. And then there are also common themes of racial microaggressions. And the one that I would like to point out that occurs within the example that we just watched together is the assumption of criminality. And so taking all of that in, when the cop said things like, "You look suspicious, where'd you get this car? A kid like him," those are all micro insults. Things like Booker looks suspicious or asking him where he got the car has hidden insulting messages because it insinuates things like maybe he stole the car when actually the car was a gift from his grandfather. And then when the cop says things like, "I'm just doing my job, this is not about race, you know what I mean, this is just a misunderstanding," asking Grandpa Baxter, "You know Police Chief Thomas," these are micro invalidations because they dismiss both Booker and his grandfather's feelings and experiences within that instance of experiencing racial microaggressions back to back to back. And so I would also like to point out that this example is tricky because we often talk about microaggressions existing on unconscious levels. So something like implicit bias, and I talked earlier about how they often happen unintentionally. However, the impact is still large and meaningful for the victim of the microaggression. And it's important to note that this cop is actually enacting in a micro assault by racial profiling. So the clip that I showed is just a small portion of an entire episode that leads up to this experience for Booker and also conveys the aftermath of this incident. But when this cop decides to pull Booker over and make him get out of the car, and actually what you don't see that happens right before the clip that I showed is that he was arresting Booker and he was accusing him of stealing the car and all of these things. This is blatant racial discrimination and thus is a micro assault. in thinking about racial microaggressions. And as someone who is striving to be a social worker, I think that some of the most important things would be to offer support to Booker and his grandfather after having experienced something so traumatic. Because again, I talked about how even though in many instances the microaggressions are unintentional, the impact is still heavily felt. So another thing that you don't see is that Booker actually talks to Raven, his mother, and he expresses to her that he is now afraid to drive because he cannot grasp and understand how, even though he did nothing wrong, he was still discriminated against and treated in such a way. So offering support to Booker and making sure that his feelings and experiences are validated is going to be very important, in my opinion. And then also to following up in some capacity to educate the cop who is the offender about why the things that he said and did were wrong, even though I'm pretty sure that on some level he knows that they were wrong, especially when at the end he says, this is just a misunderstanding, because now he knows that there may be consequences for his actions. But I think that further educating him on that would be important. And then also too, on a broader level, just continuing to advocate for change in whatever way that looks like. And then in regard to disarming the microaggression, I think in that moment, it would be important to ask questions. So asking the cop something like, can you elaborate more on why you believe he looks suspicious? Or what do you mean by a kid like him? That would essentially force him to stop and take a moment, think about what he's saying and why he's saying it. And then he would be able to then identify that his actions, behaviors, and words are problematic and that they are hurtful to Booker. Now, as someone who racially identifies the same as Booker, this may be difficult or tricky for me to come and step in and say in that moment. However, I think that even afterwards, asking him those questions and making him think about what he means when he says things like that would be very important. And so that is an example of a racial microaggression that has aired on the Disney Channel or Disney Plus, and it's a tricky one because it involves many, many layers that incorporates all of these aspects of a racial microaggression. But then, in a sense, it kind of turns it into something, again, as we've been discussing, much bigger than what a microaggression entails or implies.